Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of ADAR Unveiled. I am your host, Chrissy Hudson, and I'm joined by ADAR's executive leadership team, Dan Kelly, Doug Farrington, and Ari Voss. On today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at food waste. According to experts, every single year, the world wastes between 1.6 billion tons and 2.5 billion tons of food. So let me say those numbers again, because they're pretty staggering. 1.6 billion tons to 2.5 billion tons of food is wasted every single year on our planet. So when most people start to think about food waste, they think about it from a consumer or a retail lens. So they think about food waste at restaurants, at grocery stores, or even that waste that happens in our own kitchens. But the reality is that food waste happens across the supply chain. So food waste happens, as they say, from farm to fork. So today, we're going to dive in and actually take a look at the food waste that happens at the beginning of the supply chain. So agricultural industry and food processing industries. When we get started, please feel free to drop your questions in the comment section below. We will try our best at the end to get to everyone's questions, but just know that if we don't get to your questions, our team will be responding to those as soon as we wrap up here. All right, guys, let's dive in and get started. I think it only makes sense that we start at the beginning of the supply chain. So in the world of agriculture, Doug, I hate to put you on the spot, but as our resident ag expert, Mr. 20 plus years in the agriculture world, it's going to be you kicking us off, pal. So can you shed some light on the food waste that happens at the agricultural level? Like what types of waste are involved? How's it currently being managed? Kind of give us that starting point for food waste.
Sure. Thank you, Chrissy. Hi, everybody. I'm Doug Farrington. I'm our Chief Operating Officer. And I grew up farming, and I'm really glad Chrissy gave me this question because there's so many examples of food waste in agriculture. And what we're talking about is the plant and livestock material that's not the primary product, it's the byproducts. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Grape pomace, apple pomace, that's the stuff that's left over, the stems and seeds and skins that are left over after pressing out the juice. And apples, for an example, the apple pomace is one of the largest contributors to waste globally, with 4 million tons disposed of annually. Sugar beets is another example. The product under the ground is what is used to create sugar, but the product above the ground is, there's really no value in the stuff, so it's just wasted. Another example is chicken renderings, or turkey, or any kind of poultry, beef, pork renderings. This is the nasty stuff that's left over after processing the chicken, hog, or cow. It's the blood, guts, bones, fats, etc. And this stuff, it just goes to waste. There's many other examples: husks and shells of nuts like almonds and coconuts, citrus peels, sugar beet. I already talked about sugar beets, but corn cobs, etc.
So what is the ag industry currently doing to address some of those issues? Because like I know you mentioned that some of those products are just kind of left behind, but how are they addressing them? Because I'm sure on a farm, waste is a big deal.
Yeah, sure. There's varying ways that these waste products are addressed. Some, like apple pulp, for example, the majority of that is just transported wet to a landfill. And so the processor is incurring transportation costs, they're incurring labor costs, they're incurring tipping fees, they're putting out carbon emissions from the fossil fuels that are used in transport. So that a lot of that is just going straight to the landfill, right? So it's just wasted. Chicken renderings, as an example, is currently it's because of the water weight, the moisture in the material. It is typically just spread on local farms in the area, and that's causing a lot of air quality and water quality issues. A lot of complaints from people in the counties around that area from the odor. And there's many examples of multi-million-dollar plants that have been built to process this stuff. that go out of business, go bankrupt very quickly because they just can't make an economic. It's just not economically viable when you've got variable price in fossil fuels and you've got county residents complaining about you being there. So there's many examples that it just hasn't worked when you're transporting a heavy material like this.
It's become such a problem, right, Doug, that local farmers and local citizens are in battles in places like Iowa because farmers have land rights and the citizens that are not farmers essentially just want clean air. And so now the citizens are actually suing the county to take action against the farmers. We just saw that in the Wall Street Journal article just about 2 or 3 weeks ago that I shared with the whole team. So the bottom line is we don't know of another solution in the world right now that actually eradicates the smell from these byproducts like ADAR does, which is something we're obviously very proud of there. So,
well, yeah, and that happens actually for any material that smells. We tested many materials with a smell, and it was all gone after we process it. And that comes from manure to rendering and other nasty stuff, right? Like shrimp, for instance, that we tested, and that is something that is socially probably a big advantage that we can offer.
Well, and I think about, like, for myself, Kentucky girl, right? Grew up on a farm. A lot of the agricultural land here in Kentucky, just like across the Midwest and in the South, a lot of that farmland is no longer being farmed because it's not, it's hard these days to be a farmer and to have an appropriate ROI. So how does that expense, because Doug, you referenced, how expensive it is to transport these wet materials to even to landfills, right? How do economics play a role within what waste disposal actually looks like?
Well, I've already covered the cost of transportation, the fossil fuel usage, and the variable cost in fossil fuel. With the ADAR technology, it's all electric, right? So it's depends on the source of the electricity. But with a low energy usage, all electric technology, it can be very efficient and replace a lot of, three machines with one machine. So we're able to dehydrate, pulverize into a dry powder, kill the odors and mold and bacteria at the same time. So we're doing 3 steps in one, replacing 3 different pieces of equipment in some cases.
Right. And part of the solution, Doug, here, part of the problem and the solution is the farmers or the growers, the producers, depending on what term and what persona we're talking about here, they all have different technology on farm, right? And the level of sophistication varies drastically, even their rural location, whether or not they're close to a production facility or where they're completely out in the middle of nowhere and have to operate on their own. And so the vast majority of farmers are smallhold farmers. They're not commercial farmers, and they don't necessarily have a solution for this, right? So that's part of the other problem is they don't know what else to do with it other than just throw it away because it's the way they've always done it. So it's exciting to offer a different solution here from a hub and spoke model perspective.
Absolutely. All right. Due to time, let's kind of shift down the supply chain just a little bit. Let's talk about food processing. So we've gotten the food off the farm and into a commercial space for processing. Let's talk about what that looks like. First of all, what does it mean when we say food processing? And then how does this impact the food crisis?
So you want me to take that one, Chrissy?
Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important topic because most people think about wasted food at just the grocery store or just what we buy in our refrigerators and we throw away, which is obviously a huge problem. But the problem starts far up the upstream, if you will, up the supply chain. And it's not just on farm, but it's actually in the processing centers themselves. So when a farmer or a grower producer sells it to a processing center, to create the end product, there's an incredible amount of waste that happens there. And we're not talking about just raw fruits and veggies peeling anymore. We're talking about trimming, peeling, refining things from potatoes to animals, quite frankly. And when we think about meat, just because we're talking about that recently with Doug from an animal byproduct perspective, it contributes to an overall waste problem significantly. Not only just the smell, but impact on landfills, release of methane, release on carbon emissions. And the bottom line is there's some parts to an animal, as an example, that food processors don't know what to do with, or it's just not economically viable for them to do anything with. Such as an example, I have 4 dogs, I have 4 golden doodles. They love buying bones. I go to farmers markets, etc. And it makes me happy, quite frankly, because I know the hooves of cattle, etc., are now used as chewing bones for my dogs that I pay for. And so there's a whole usage of that animal. But besides that, there's a lot of those type of products, the guts, the bones, etc., that are not used today. And the bottom line is I use the equivalent of like a watermelon. If you buy a whole watermelon and you're just taking a portion of the watermelon, a quarter of the watermelon, you're using that today because that's what looks the best and it's what will sell the best on store. What are you doing with the other 3/4 of the watermelon? And that's the point. Right now, it's really thrown away, and the ultimate situation is the producers are doing very little in that space to save and reproduce the waste because there's not many solutions out there that they can do anything with. So they'll do what they know they can do. They can throw it on the farm and have it naturally decompose.
What you say is that about, for instance, the renderings and the products that you can buy, but from a technical point of view, right? If you look at it very systematically, all these renderings contain of proteins, of calcium and fats, right? And as long as you can actually clean that from bacteria and make it a clean product, then it is still certainly viable and it is still usable for other purposes. And that is a bit, I think, what I've from my technical background on this always wanted to accomplish is how can you turn that waste into something valuable that can be used again in whatever way, right? And I think that there are certain ways that we can make that profitable again, instead of just disposing it, creating a lot of smell, creating a lot of complaints, having a lot of costs, and nobody gets better of it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I know one time you talked about a use case with eggs that weren't perfect. I thought that was really
rejected eggs.
Yeah. I mean, that's not a byproduct, so to speak, but it is a byproduct of the egg cleaning process, I suppose. Maybe just talk to that for a minute, because I think that's an important different way of looking at waste.
Yeah, well, but we did a test with a company that has a million rejected eggs per week. And why is that? Because we as consumers, we want the eggs to be beautiful, shaped, and right size and right color and all these things, right? But an egg that doesn't meet those requirements is not worse than any other egg, but it is rejected. So the cost of disposing all these eggs is really large because of the smell of it. Everybody knows what that is, rotten egg smell. Now, we also know that in the egg's shell, there's this little film, this rubbery film when you boil an egg, and it seems that material has certain value for the cosmetic and pharmaceutical industries. So we tested eggs in our system, and out came these rubber films as whole films or parts of films that could be very easily separated. And suddenly you create from something that is now in big volume being disposed of, suddenly you can create something that is very easy to filter out and produce in certain quantities that the industry needs.
In a very precise and consistent way, Ari, right? In a very precise and consistent way from the output, from a powderization perspective.
Right.
That's very different than what the market can offer right now.
Absolutely. And those are materials that are very difficult to collect in large volume, but we can do it and create value out of what is normally just a cost factor.
Wow. I'm still trying to digest 1 million eggs that are wasted every week. It's
not the only company, Chrissy, in the
country
that there's many more.
Exactly. It makes you stop and pause when you pick up that dozen eggs at the grocery store. How many were wasted to get you the pretty dozen that you picked up, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to kind of pivot a little bit. So one of the beauties of our executive leadership team at ADAR is we actually have Ari as our Chief Technology Officer. And for those of you all who don't know, Ari is actually one of the initiators of ADAR's ADS technology. So he's actually one of the inventors of the technology that we utilize. So Ari, I'd like to kind of kick this question to you a little bit because you know the ADS from day one till current, right? Can you talk about, and you guys have already as a group spoken a little bit to it, but can you talk about how ADS is different from a lot of the commercial dryers that are on the market that are currently being used, like in the ag space and in the food processing space? How are we different?
Well, that is a very interesting thing. If you look at the existing methods to dry food and dry any other product, by the way, so for instance, agricultural waste or municipal waste, many other products, but especially for food, the traditional way to dry food in order to preserve it for future use is to use fossil fuel based thermal heating systems. So you have belts and the material is being spread out over the belt, and it goes on for an hour on the let's say 150 Fahrenheit in Celsius, about 19 to 95 Celsius, and that material dries out over a long time in this very high temperature. That affects the quality of the food. It will eliminate some of the good nutrients that is in that food and that we actually need. So that is next to that, those systems use most of the time fossil fuels and a lot, very expensive in energy use. They create a lot of CO2 footprint. They have a big physical footprint. And it is an expensive system. Now, our view when my team started to develop this was, is it possible to do it completely the other way around? Can we do it in a single second? Can we do it not by thermal energy, by kinetic energy, right? Which is far more efficient? And can we do this also at room temperature? So we don't want to add any heat that affects the food quality. And can we do it in a way that it is a continuous process, 24/7? So our system that we developed over the years does exactly what we wanted. We bring material in a very high speed. We create acoustic shock waves by kinetic energy, electrical energy only, not fossil. Nothing like that. We don't add any heat, and it goes in and it immediately comes out. Dry, powdered, and sanitized or hygienized, I think is the word. And it happens constantly. So we can add 2 tons per hour in our machine. We have a constant feed in and we have a constant feed out. That means that the quality of the food that we process is not affected. It is just dried, it is powdered or pulverized, so it is easy to compact it, it's easy to transport. We lost a lot of weight, we lost a lot of volume. So when you transport it, you save on the transportation cost, you save on the CO2, you save on the CO2 by not creating that all when you use the traditional thermal system. So I think that our system is actually a revolution in the industry for food processing.
Absolutely. And just the fact that it can be done on farm instead of having to haul wet materials away is pretty incredible, right?
Well, we're actually going one step further, and this is in our design planning for 2025, that we will come up with mobile units. So we can actually, what I'm aiming for is that we can process and material on the field.
That is pretty incredible. Or, think about the implications for the small farmer. Dan, a few moments ago, was talking about how the majority of farmers, specifically in the US, are, small field farmers, right, versus commercial. So how incredible would it be for like local farming cooperatives to have access to a mobile unit, so it's not the financial implication of the one single small farmer, but it's the entire cooperative to be able to share and process still on field with a rotation, sort of like the milkman of days gone by on a dairy farm, right? That rotation.
Yeah, it is like a corporation that can have one machine and they share it.
Absolutely.
And we have a capacity of about, for a single cord, about 2 metric tons per hour. That is about 4,200, 300 pounds per hour. And that is quite a substantial amount. So if you have a field and you can, let's say 10 hours a day, you can process up to 44,000 pounds on that day.
Wow. So you guys sort of talked a little bit about this, specifically when we were talking about animal byproducts and utilizing the whole, whether it's a whole plant, a whole vegetable, whole animal, right? But talk to me some about what the output after material is processed through the ADS. Of course, I'm sure it depends on, the specific material that was processed, but talk some to what that output can be used for. How can ADAR's output from the machine be used for something good?
Do you want me to take that, Chrissy?
Go for it.
Okay. Well, there are all kinds of different food materials. You have seafood, for instance, with a lot of fats, a lot of proteins, especially, and a lot of seafood is wasted before even consuming or processing, because it's never sold, but it is still caught. It is being preserved in coolers. But at one day they have to get rid of it. But the ingredients of it are very valuable. If you have fruits, for instance, there's fibers in it, and there is vitamins in it. Doug already mentioned apple pulp and grape pomace, and there's carbohydrates in it. When you, for instance, talk about potatoes. I mean, and there's many other things like avocado pits that contain materials that are actually useful, but nobody uses them because they are hard things. There's so many products that contain different materials. So what we think is that when we dry and process those materials, then we get a combination of fibers, of vitamins, of calcium, of proteins, and it is all hygienized or sanitized. So when you mix those components, right, we think that we could create, for instance, animal feed with very natural, eco-friendly ingredients. And of course, you may need some other stuff like minerals that the animals need, but we create the basis for a very healthy and eco-friendly system to create food for animals. And the amount of food wasted today is so big that we think we could address a big chunk or a big part of the need in the animal feeding world.
Well, I was just going to say that besides just animal feed, we can use the same end product for fertilizer on farm in a precision farming perspective. That's a huge deal because of the consistency that we are creating as the output of the stream, which allows the end user, whoever that is, whoever a customer is, to pelletize. And when you pelletize, you can also create energy. You can use it for energy production. You're going to say something,
But then you can also, you can mix the food output that we process with all kinds of other agricultural output, like grass clippings, like sargassum and seaweeds and all kinds of stuff that we take from the land, right? Tomato stalks from all the other plants, which are normally always disposed of. If you mix that, you can create a great fertilizer. And
everything would be organic.
Yeah, absolutely.
We forget sometimes to talk about that. Everything is essentially an organic product after. Which is pretty amazing. So,
and we want to reduce CO2 footprint for everybody involved.
Yep.
All right, guys, due to time, we're going to kind of pivot into Q&A. We do have some questions. Give me just a second to switch screens a bit so I can see those. All right. So our first question, how does food waste affect the economy? Man, that is like a loaded question. And then what are on the flip side, what are the financial implications of minimizing food waste? Who wants to take that one?
I can hop in with some initial thoughts. I mean, this is a big question, obviously, that no one company is going to tackle completely, but from a broad strokes perspective, the financial impacts on waste is significant. And I'll start by just saying it's the basic principles of supply and demand. So, you know, the general consensus is about 30% of all food is wasted globally. The Feeding America, actually, on the US side, which is a wonderful organization, actually predicts that 40% of food is wasted in the US, which is a higher number than the rest of the world, which probably doesn't surprise anyone within the US just based on our commercial practices. And so, quite frankly, it's a double whammy throughout the entire system, from producer down to consumer. And when we have less supply to produce food for consumers that have a higher demand, prices go up for everyone. So supply and demand economics, lower supply, high demand creates high prices. And when we can create more alternatives and more food supply, prices go down, which is an anti-inflationary technique that maybe we should bring over to the Fed. But I don't know. We'll talk about that later. But on the flip side, if we eliminate the waste and we create revenue opportunities for public and private sectors on these waste items, then our costs go down, our revenue goes up. And the bottom line is, in a capitalistic system, to create pull-through through the market. And that's what we're doing here. So there's a massive broad economic opportunity of converting waste into revenue streams, not just to feed the hungry, which is extremely important, but also to improve profitability for companies and to increase shareholder value globally.
And just to build on what Dan's saying, you know, even just the transportation change, right? So the reduced transportation, we're seeing things like 84% reduction in transportation costs. Obviously, that has a financial implication as well on the economy.
Yeah, just that is crazy. But, you know, we don't think about it when food or waste is transported. Typically, you don't think about the moisture content. And if you remove that water, just how much less weight is involved. And of course, we all know, you know, transportation is weight-based. So, wow. All right. Got another question. And Doug, I know you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but are there certain types of food waste that are more prone to being wasted than others?
Yeah, sure. Products that, yeah, I did touch on this a little bit already, but products that are high in moisture content would be the first place I would look, and products that are prone to mold and bacteria, as an example. You know, when I worked in the wine business, and the grape, you know, today grape pomace, after the juice is pressed out to make wine, there's stems, seeds, and skins left over. And some of that is transported wet at high transportation costs. Other wineries are solar drying that material, and it takes like 3 days to dry it. And you have the risk of contamination from animals and birds flying over it and so forth. So it's not ideal. And because of that contamination, you can't necessarily use it in certain applications like healthcare, nutraceuticals, cosmetics, etc., unless you clean it up, which in the case of ADAR, if you could feed that grape pomace right out of the press into our machine, we could turn it instantly into a dry powder, which then can be economically transported and used as colorants or nutraceuticals because it's free of contaminants.
And it wouldn't rot anymore because everything that is wet will rot.
Yeah, exactly. So shelf life becomes good. You know, it's just not it's not full of mold or bacteria at that point.
Right. And I know within the supply chain, that transportation piece regarding mold and mildew, bacteria growth, all of that is a major factor, right, as far as food loss. So it's pretty awesome that dry material, sanitized material, longer shelf life, right?
And has regulatory restrictions specifically in Europe. Art, do you want to speak about that real quick? About even just talking about the manure use case. I always describe it as our most kind of boring use case, but it's produces huge ROI for the customer just by eliminating water weight. We're talking about transportation, because 80% of manure is basically water, but also it has to be sanitized, et cetera. So can you talk about that just briefly for the people watching, because I don't think most people know that in Europe, the sensitivity to that.
Well, I actually think that a lot of this is similar in the US. For instance, you cannot transport fresh manure cross border, and as far as I know, that also applies cross state in the US. So what you have to do, you have to sanitize it before you are allowed to export it to another country. Now, if you look where I live in the Netherlands, we have a lot of production of manure, but we have not enough land to use it for. So the government and also European regulations require that it is industrially processed, which is extremely expensive for both the farmers as the government. There's a lot of fraud coming with that because people try to get rid of it without having to pay for it and all these things. Now, if you now look at that, for instance, every day, 300 trucks full with manure, which is pre-pressed, so it is not 92% anymore, which is standard. It is gone back to, let's say, 70%. So they do some centrifuges or decanter pressing. But anyway, you still have a thick sludge, and it is all transported to France, because in France they have very large areas of poor soil quality. So they need the fertilizer of the manure. And it is an extremely expensive operation. And the same thing happens even in our small country with, let's say, human manure, right? Sewage. Also, every night, trucks go to one central place where it is incinerated. And to incinerate material that has 70% moisture still in it won't work. So you have to add a lot of fossil fuel first to dry it out before it actually starts creating energy itself. That's what we try to avoid. So if you, for instance, have a small system of ADAR, which is only one container that can process, let's say, 40 metric tons per day on manure or on sewage sludges, and then suddenly the immense volume that you have locally is shrunk down to let's say 10 to 15% of it. So you can also save 80% of all your truckloads.
Yeah. Wow. All right, guys.
Those regulations, by the way, those regulations are getting stronger and stronger and stronger. There's new regulations coming up in Europe in 2026, where you are also, for instance, not allowed to transport anything that comes from meat processing plants anymore. Right? You have to do it on site because you are not allowed to transport, and this applies to all of Europe.
Wow. All right, guys, we're running out of time. We've got time for one more audience question.
If you have getting interesting, Chris.
I know. Food waste, manure, we got it all covered. It's okay. If you have asked a question in the comments and we have not gotten to it yet, again, I promise as soon as we wrap up here, our team will dive in and we'll start responding to your questions. So last question to kind of tie us up. What can consumers, so switching from that ag and industrial lens, what can consumers do to reduce food waste? How can they play a part? But also, how can they support companies like ADAR who are on a mission to impact the food crisis globally?
I'll take the first stab at that one, Chrissy. It comes down to mindful shopping, just on a consumer behavior. I know this is easy to talk about. Sometimes it's harder to execute. I sometimes catch myself in this mode constantly, since I have kids and they'll pull everything off the shelf, if you will. But it's just buying what you need when you need it. It's kind of just-in-time shopping, I like to call it, just-in-time manufacturing. You might take an extra trip or two to the store. Of course, if it's 100 miles to the store, maybe make different decisions. Use common sense, of course. But when you're in an urban area, like most people are, it's just mindful shopping, and don't confuse the sell by date with a consume by date on the actual products that you're buying, and ultimately use your freezer. Buy stuff that you can throw in the freezer, that will be maintained for weeks or months on end. But it's all comes down to portion control. That's really the easiest thing that I've studied this space for quite some time, and consumer behavior is hard to change. But if people can just make the simple change of plan for a week versus plan for a month in perishable items, I think you'd see a huge impact to your waste bin and to your budget, quite frankly.
So one of the things
if
that
you do that
just
mindfully, if you
Yes.
do that mindfully, it will save you at least 10% of your food budget.
So one of the things that Dan said was plan for blah, blah, blah. Menu planning is a huge thing at my house. I don't want to have to think at the end of the day what I'm fixing for dinner, right? I figured that out on grocery day. So being intentional, that's a great one. Other thoughts as far as from consumers, from a consumer perspective?
That's right. And you can also just make when you're actually at the store or wherever you buy your products, choose sustainable brands. This is a life choice. And yes, sometimes there's an additional cost, and some people can't afford that additional cost, and that's okay. But for the people that can, choose brands that truly have auditable, sustainable practices. And quite frankly, that's why ADAR exists here too, to make those processors sustainable. And so help spread awareness of different ways in which you can support your local economies and lower your waste.
All right. Awesome. All right. We are totally out of time. If you left a question in the comment box below, we will get to it relatively quickly. If you've thought of a question afterwards, drop us a comment, send us a DM. We will respond, because we want this to be the beginning of a conversation, not a one-time discussion. If you have questions about ADAR technologies, visit us at www.adartech.com, or you can follow us on social media. We are on most platforms at either ADAR Technologies or ADAR Tech. So everyone, have a wonderful day. Dan, Ari, Doug, thank you guys for joining us. Thank you for the wonderful conversation. And we will be back soon with our next episode of ADAR Unveiled. Thank you all.
Thank you, Chrissy.
Thanks, everyone.
Chrissy.